Hello and welcome to the Korean War Module 3, Legacies of the Korean War. In this module, we'll cover the long-term consequences of the Korean War for both the North and the South. But before we get started, let's take a look at our questions. First with our major questions. Who is responsible for the Korean War? And when did the Korean War begin and when did it end? And now for our Module 3 questions. First, why is Korea still divided? Second, how has the Korean War continued to affect developments on the peninsula? And third, which of the two Koreas has experienced more success? Now, as we proceed through this module, our theme is diverging paths and continued tension. Looking back to the end of the Korean War on July 27, 1953, the warring parties signed an armistice, and in the preamble to that armistice it read, "In the interest of stopping the Korean conflict, with its great toil of suffering and bloodshed on both sides, and with the objective of establishing an armistice which will ensure a complete cessation of hostilities and of all acts of armed force in Korea until a final peaceful settlement is achieved." This passage highlights that while the parties involved in the fighting wanted to see a cessation of the hostilities, they were not establishing a lasting peace. This was supposed to be the first step towards possibly doing so. However, in the decades following the war, the two Koreas took sometimes similar but divergent paths. Following the war, North Korea continued to establish itself under the Kim family dictatorial dynasty. So Kim Il-sung continued to be the leader of North Korea, and in that process he created his cult of personality, which is a situation in which a political figure is deliberately presented to the people of a country as a great person who should be admired and loved. And in the years following the Korean War, Kim Il-sung became something that bordered on a deity in North Korea. He was referred to regularly as the supreme leader, the fatherly leader, or the great son. Kim Il-sung also replaced communism with Juche as North Korea's guiding ideology. Juche is an ideology in which the North Korean leadership stressed extreme forms of self-reliance. Anything that North Korea needed to be something that could be produced within North Korea itself. But this push for self-reliance ultimately created many hardships for the North Korean people in the last few decades of Kim Il-sung's rule, which lasted until 1994. He was replaced by his son Kim Jong-il, who governed North Korea from 1994 until his death in 2011. He was known as the Dear Leader and was known widely around the world for being the leader who oversaw the development of North Korea's first nuclear bomb. The latest Kim to govern North Korea is Kim Jong-un, who took over for his father after his death in 2011. He is the current leader of North Korea and is named the Marshal or the Dear Respected Leader. Looking at the images on the right, his photograph is the one on the top. On the bottom left is Kim Il-sung, and on the bottom right is Kim Jong-il. Following the war, North Korea remained very closely tied with China and Russia, and the social organization of North Korea was very closely related to that of China's and Russia's, but with Korean characteristics. At the center were the nuclear masses, the Korean Workers' Party, government officials, military officials, and people who were anti-Japanese guerrillas during the Second World War. The non-nuclear masses, or people who were less central, were non-party workers, farmers, and clerical workers. But the most undesirable class were those who had bad family backgrounds. They were former middle-class people, former landlords, capitalists, or party critics. Christians were also a persecuted class, with all Catholic priests and Protestant ministers being executed in 1962. All in all, in this system, an individual or family's political history is what was important in terms of determining someone's position in North Korean society. In the years following the war, North Korea did have some advantages over its South Korean counterpart. They received considerable aid from the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China, and the region also had a great deal of mineral reserves. Not to mention, North Korea experienced greater industrial growth than the South, largely due to Japanese investment during and leading up to World War II. Even though by the 1980s North Korea was technologically less advanced than the South, the per capita GNP was arguably equal to the South's up until roughly 1983. But since the 1980s, North Korea has been increasingly impoverished, and in the 1990s they suffered a very severe famine, with a death toll that could be as high as 3 million people. Not to mention, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, North Korea has been almost completely isolated since the late 1980s, early 1990s. Their isolation was only made worse by their insistence on developing a nuclear weapons program, and in 2006 they detonated their first nuclear bomb. Like their neighbors to the north, the South Korean government was dominated by military dictatorships, only they were not hereditary and they didn't really have a cult of personality. But, like their neighbors to the north, they were willing to kill or jail their opponents. The first dictator is Syngman Rhee. He's the guy on the top right. He was the leader during the Korean War and passed a controversial national security law that allowed him to crack down on dissidents. He was eventually forced out by a massive student movement in 1960. Korea's second dictator, Park Chung-hee, he's the guy in the middle, was South Korea's longest ruling dictator. He governed South Korea from 1963 all the way until 1979. He revised the constitution in 1972 to keep himself in power and used the Korean CIA in 1973 to kidnap his political rival. His term only came to an end in 1979 when he was assassinated, shot in the head by a Korean CIA agent. The final South Korean dictator is Jun Do-won. He declared martial law during his term and closed universities altogether. In fact, he even banned all political activity and arrested his opposition. He managed to take control of Korea from roughly 1980 until he was forced to retire in 1988. It was only after Jun Do-won was forced to retire in 1988 that South Korea would ultimately free itself from its cycle of military dictatorships. Unlike North Korea, who sided closely with the People's Republic of China and Russia, South Korea remained closely tied to the West. It signed a mutual defense treaty with the United States and received enormous amounts of U.S. military and economic aid between 1950 and 1970. South Korea received almost 8% of all U.S. foreign economic and military assistance. Only Israel received more in per capita aid from the United States. But this sort of help also came with tensions. One tension was that 200 U.S. nuclear warheads were stationed on South Korean soil. And the problem was that this made South Korea a target in the event of a shooting war between the United States and the USSR. They were also talked into normalizing relations with Japan in 1965. Japan was an important Western ally, so they had to have good relationships with Japan. One last major point of tension was the Vietnam War, which was a widely unpopular war not only in the United States but around the world. Korean troops fought alongside the U.S. troops during this war, which lasted from roughly the mid-1960s until the mid-1970s. As compensation, the South Korean government was paid $1 billion US. But the bigger win for South Korea was it created a war boom for the Korean economy. Basically, the Korean economy benefited from supplying U.S. military men and personnel as they fought in Southeast Asia. All in all, North Korea and South Korea started from fairly similar points, but they have taken divergent paths in the post-war period. While both were dominated by dictators, South Korea became increasingly an integral part of the international community. In fact, South Korea successfully hosted the Summer Olympics in 1988 and even co-hosted the World Cup with Japan in 2002. It is now the 12th largest economy in the world, behind Russia and Australia. North Korea, on the other hand, has become increasingly isolated since the 1980s, and today it doesn't even rank as one of the world's top 100 economies. North Korea's missile tests, which regularly send missiles over its nearby neighbors like Japan, and its detonating of a nuclear bomb in 2006 and a hydrogen bomb in 2016, has left North Korea with few friends in the international community. Not to mention, fighting stemming from the Korean War has never really ended, and every so often, conflicts between the North and the South flare up. In the 1960s, between 1966 and 1969, fighting around the demilitarized zone was particularly intense. Additionally, in 1968, 31 North Korean commandos launched an unsuccessful assassination attempt against then Korean President Park Chung-hee. More recently, the North and the South fought small-scale naval engagements around Yongpyong Island, and there was a severe exchange of artillery fire in the same area in 2010. So while an armistice may have been signed in 1953, a war still simmers beneath the surface on the Korean peninsula. Now that you have completed all of the videos, I will leave you with our questions to consider. Having watched everything, you should be prepared to answer or at least form opinions about the following questions. While some of the questions may appear obvious, be sure to think about them from as many different directions as you can.